icon can be defined as a person widely admired, especially having great influence or cultural significance, regarded as a representative symbol or worthy of veneration. Over a century after his death, Theodore Roosevelt remains one of the most recognizable figures in American history. Depictions of the man range from the heroic commander of the Rough Riders and strenuous cowboy president to a trailblazing progressive politician and early environmentalist, to little more than a caricature of grinning teeth hiding behind a mustache and pince-nez spectacles. Today's guest, Professor Michael Patrick Cullinane, in his 2017 book, Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon, examines how successive generations have shaped the public memory of Roosevelt through their depictions of him in memorials, political invocations, art and architecture, historical scholarship, literature, and in popular culture. Though continually refashioned in public memory, Theodore Roosevelt remains one of our most enduring, iconic Americans. Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost was named the 2018 Book of the Year by the Theodore Roosevelt Association and remains the most highly regarded work examining TR in American public memory. Professor Michael Patrick Cullinane, an award-winning author and historian, is the Loman Walton Chair of Theodore Roosevelt Studies at Dickinson State University. He also serves as the public historian for the Theodore Roosevelt Association and is contributing to the curation of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, due to open in July 2026 in Medora, North Dakota. In addition to his academic work and public speaking, he also hosts the popular podcast called The Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In other words, Professor Cullinane is a pretty busy guy, and Larry and I were fortunate to catch up with him recently to talk about Teddy. Michael Patrick Cullinane, welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here, guys. As well as TR would say, I'm delighted.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to this for some time. So, Michael, you have this background, academic background, publishing in American imperialism. You actually host a podcast also on the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. So, where does your interest in Roosevelt come about?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned imperialism, because we know that TR certainly had a strong position on American power in the world. He wanted to increase American power in the world, and I think it's safe to say that by most accounts, TR was an imperialist. I mean, there's different guises and all that as well, and degrees, but TR definitely believed that the United States should have a larger role to play in world affairs and believed in intervening in world affairs. And the first group of people that I studied were a group of Americans known as the anti-imperialists. And they were around at the end of the 19th century, and they were opposed to American colonization of places like the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, but really the Philippines. The Philippines is a 5,000 island archipelago with 10 million people living in it. And the anti-imperialists were opposed to America's annexation of those islands. Now, TR sort of inherited the Philippines because the policies of McKinley are what dictated the acquisition of those islands to the United States. But TR enthusiastically sought to, he probably would have said civilize them. I think what he very much meant to do was to bring the ideas and institutions of American democracy to the Philippines. Of course, there was a 15-year war that waged there, and the people that were opposed to that policy really disliked TR's views, but they really got on with him. I mean, not in all cases, but our politics now are so far removed from the difference between a policy disagreement and a personal dislike that I was fascinated by Roosevelt. How could Roosevelt be, politically opposed to someone and break bread with them in the White House the day after an argument, right? Yeah. So I would love if our politics could get back to what they were when TR was president. Amen. And I think that's what kind of inspired me to start thinking about him more and his legacy more.
Yeah. So what you've written with your 2017 book, Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon, this is not a biography of Roosevelt. This is not a straight academic historiography of all of the hundreds of works published on Roosevelt. So can you think of what caused this spark for you to want to look at Roosevelt's legacy?
Yes. So I remember exactly the moment that I thought about this book, and it was before I finished my PhD, which was about the anti-imperialist movement. I was watching the 2000 Republican presidential primary debates in Iowa, and there were 10 candidates on the stage, and the moderator asked this really great but challenging question to the 10 candidates: "Who's your favorite philosopher?" And, there was some pretty wishy-washy answers. And the last two people to comment, well, the penultimate answer was from John McCain. And John McCain was a big fan of Theodore Roosevelt. And straight away he goes, Theodore Roosevelt, and that's a good answer. Theodore Roosevelt, an American philosopher. And then George W. Bush was last. And his answer was Jesus Christ. And I said, well, that's the right answer. Because you're going to win voters with that answer more than you are with the Theodore Roosevelt. But the Theodore Roosevelt answer was really interesting because I thought, how many politicians have invoked Theodore Roosevelt over the years? And it turns out that every president, with the exception of one, a most recent president, not Biden, but Donald Trump, has invoked Theodore Roosevelt in their political proclamations or in signing legislation or even invoking them as their lodestar and political guide. Like Bill Clinton and George W. Bush both said that they kind of worshipped Theodore Roosevelt as their political guru and Sherpa. So I wanted to figure out how people that were so different could find the same inspiration in a man like Theodore Roosevelt. And it turns out that it's not just politics, but it's pop culture and historians. And, there's all these various takes on Theodore Roosevelt since his death in 1919 that I thought we needed what I've kind of taken to call it as a posthumous biography. It's the history of his life after he died, because we've really used and abused him an awful lot in those 100 years.
Well, I know after he died, your book mentions the memorials, the vast array of those. Could you describe some of those for us?
I mean, some of them are spectacular. I mean, let me give you a couple examples that might interest listeners. So, listeners will know that just recently a statue of Theodore Roosevelt came down in front of the American Museum of Natural History. It was a sculpture that James Earl Fraser did. It was friends with Theodore Roosevelt, and it was taken down because it has TR on horseback, flanked by a Maasai warrior, an African Maasai warrior, and a Native American, I'm guessing a chief based on the headgear. So it does not do a good job of telling the story of racial equality. It's got a white man on horseback, and it's got an African and a Native American on this side and lower down. So they removed that statue. The really interesting thing is about the outrage that people had about it coming down, because, of course, Theodore Roosevelt was not a Confederate, and we've seen so many Confederate statues come down, right? He was he believed deeply in the Reconstruction Constitution. So, and his family didn't own slaves. So this was curious, and for me, I knew that Theodore Roosevelt never wanted a statue of himself. In fact, he told his wife and his son, and if anyone ever wants the sources on that, I'm happy to drag those up, because plenty of people have told me, how do you know what Theodore Roosevelt would want? Well, his wife and his son say he never wanted a statue, but particularly never wanted a statue of him on horseback. Yeah. Now, how interesting is that we've decided over and over again to reproduce memorials of Theodore Roosevelt, either his image, his statue of him, or on horseback. And frankly, we don't really listen to what the dead want at all, or even what the living want in some cases. So another really good example is if you visit Manhattan, you can visit the site of Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace, which is on East 20th Street. That is a replica house, because Theodore Roosevelt's house was knocked down in, I think, 1905, 1906, something like that. And a few years later, a commercial structure was erected there. The only reason why the house was knocked down is because Theodore Roosevelt wanted it knocked down. In fact, there was a movement to try and save his house and create a sort of shrine to Theodore Roosevelt there. And he said, I don't want it. And what happens? He passes away. And a few years later, the Women's Roosevelt Memorial Association builds the thing that he didn't want. So we're really good at putting up things that we think replicate or embody or personify or portray a person, but it's usually a reflection of what we want. And I think that's the kind of takeaway from the book, is that we are really the agents of Roosevelt's memory. He's gone, and we're producing largely fictions in a lot of cases of the past.
Yeah.
Can I read a little excerpt from the first part of your book? It's a quote from John Dewey about everyone who goes into political life gradually grows up a double. And that double consists of the acts of the original individual reflected first in the imagination and then in the desires and the acts of other men. And that TR's double is going to grow immense over time because he so captured that imagination of his countrymen. It dawned on me that maybe the only thing after he died that people actually listened to was that his funeral be simple. But after that, it seems as if none of his desires for memorialization or how he'd be remembered or legacy is what he would have wanted, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to be too despondent about that, because I think you can get down and say, oh, well, we can't really get to the exact truth and understand the past exactly as it was lived. But I think that's okay too. I think that ultimately we can take away lessons as long as we say to ourselves with a degree of self-awareness that this isn't exactly what it was. That is gone. But in terms of TR, I mean, gosh, there are so many lessons that we can take from his life and things that we can learn and applications of his legacy. But we have to just realize that it's through our eyes that we're doing that, and that it's really that we're the agents of those actions, not TR.
Yeah.
I think it's great that you brought up the John Dewey. I mean, John Dewey's pretty heavy stuff, so you got to do a little bit of lifting, even in reading Dewey. But another really good example is when James Earl Fraser, the same guy who made that statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History, Fraser also cast the death mask and the casting of TR's hands. So when TR died, Edith Kermit Roosevelt, his wife, allowed Fraser to go upstairs, or I think it was actually downstairs, into the north room where he was laying in state, and he put plaster of Paris on TR's face. And that's really the first memorial we have of TR. And what's interesting is that it comes directly from the man itself, so you can't get more direct. And yet people that saw the mask, they said, well, this isn't him, and there's a poet who wrote it famously that it just lacked TR's soul. And I think that's interesting too, that people knew that there wasn't, not that all these memorials aren't exactly the real thing. They require us to put our souls into them in order to interpret them.
Yeah.
He's so multifaceted, even in his lifetime. He meant so many different things to so many people while he lived. It's not surprising that in his death that continues.
Yeah, that's absolutely right,
Yeah, and I know in your book the memorials you mentioned weren't just statues. There were some I think he may have actually been pleased with, things like nature preserves. I think he would have enjoyed, Theodore Roosevelt National Park later. I think he would have thought that was a bully idea.
Yeah, and I think those are the memorials that require you to get involved, right? It's not just something that's artistic that you look upon, but that you have to get outdoors. And in terms of his legacy, I don't think there's any other president that loved the outdoors as much as he did. So kind of without question, things that would get people involved in outdoors would certainly be a great one. I think there's a lot of movies and films that he would have loved, actually, that depict him. I think A Night at the Museum is a great film. And also, that whole tongue-in-cheek, there's a scene where Ben Stiller is talking to Robin Williams. Robin Williams plays the Theodore Roosevelt character. And Robin Williams looks to Ben Stiller and says something like, this is all make-believe. I'm just made out of wax. And that sort of tongue-in-cheek thing, I think, there's a humor behind that would have been appealing too. So there's lots of things that I think we can take away in terms of legacy. The book sets out 5 major areas. One is TR's Americanism. Another is his progressivism. Another is conservation. And one of the last ones, I think probably one of the most important ones, that TR was a preacher. He was a great publicist, and that is really what makes him someone that we remember nowadays. The reason why he was an effective president is because he was able to get his ideas to the American public and convince them that they were the right ideas. So there's so much to take away in terms of leadership there. And I think the cowboy image is another one. All of those images also have two sides to them, which is also going back to your point about him being multifaceted. Take the progressive for a moment, right? Progressives, I mean, that's a dirty word for some people, but for other people, it identifies their political identity. So, but TR straddled or maybe sat on that fence a little bit too. So when he died, socialists said he wasn't progressive enough. And, diehard conservatives were like, he was far too progressive for me. But that actually has allowed him to transcend a lot of the political debates. And, people can take parts of his progressivism and say that it fits with their own political identity.
I was going to ask if you could speak to the memorial associations that began to form immediately after his death in 1919.
Yeah, sure. So, 3 days after he dies in New York, there is a meeting of really a number of prominent men. And it is all men, and they're called the Roosevelt Memorial Association. And they begin a fundraising campaign that's wildly successful. They raise millions of dollars within the first year to erect a national memorial to Roosevelt. And they have other ideas as well. A competing group emerges maybe only a few days later of women. And they are wildly successful, not in raising money, but creating a memorial that they believe is going to speak to Roosevelt's Americanism. So they, within 4 years, purchased the birthplace or the site of the birthplace in East 20th Street. And they, their plan is that it's a very political plan. Interestingly, these women, which are mainly New York socialites, and they want to make the house a teaching grounds or a place where they can teach immigrants American values. And there's a connotation in there too that immigrants might have un-American values. And they talked about making sure that there was no anarchists and communists in America. And they were worried that immigrants might be the most likely candidates for those sort of political ideologies. They're not successful in the long run because they're political. Whereas the men's group is decidedly apolitical. Yeah. And they want to focus on a memorial that is artistic in nature that can transcend a single generation. So while Americanism was a very popular idea in the 1920s, like this is the first Red Scare, you could imagine that sort of patriotic ideology would have been very popular. The men said that, and they knew and they were cognizant that would wane and that they would need something that's more lasting. But it takes them forever to come up with a memorial plan that is suitable to the country. So believe it or not, where Thomas Jefferson is memorialized today, Theodore Roosevelt was meant to be memorialized, and the men's group sets up a competition to create a marble memorial in the tidal basin. And John Russell Pope wins that competition, and there's a huge, expansive marble field and 150 colonnades and a big 200-foot geyser that's supposed to spout up in the middle of the tidal basin. And basically, it all comes together in about 1924. And that's the year that Woodrow Wilson dies. And, of course, TR and Wilson did not get along. And the politics of it all are basically laid bare before the American public. And he doesn't get the spot in the tidal basin. And so the Roosevelt Memorial Association needs to realign or rejig their efforts to find a more suitable space. And they settle on what was then known as Anal Ostin Island, which is now known as TR Island, which is a 88-acre island in the middle of the Potomac, just due west of the Lincoln Memorial. And I think it's a wonderful spot for TR for a number of reasons. It's designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who is one of the greatest landscape architects ever. And he wanted to make a primeval forest on the space there. And that seems to me in keeping with the idea of TR as an outdoorsman and a conservationist. Of course, in time, people, as I was saying at the outset of this talk, people decide that they have a better idea. And so they put a statue there and they put a grander memorial that probably undermined the idea that Olmsted had. But what's great about it is it's not easy to get to, and it makes people work. And I think that is something that is very Rooseveltian as well. You go there and you're rewarded with a bit of nature, but also a bit of how in the world did he get here. And so these two groups eventually merge. The women's group and the men's group eventually merge in the 1950s, and they're also responsible then for other places like Sagamore Hill becoming a national memorial. And other spots like Oyster Bay Memorial Park and others. So they're really important. They are the main agents of TR's memory in the world, and they still exist today. The Theodore Roosevelt Association is still around. Same congressionally chartered organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a few pictures of some of the schematics of some of those really grand designs that were being thrown around there in the early and mid-20s for the tidal basin, what's going to become the Jefferson Memorial. That's astonishing to look at the scale of some of those early designs and then see what they ended up getting on TR Island. With the exception of, what is it, like a 16, 17-foot statue of Roosevelt presiding over the island. The Roosevelt family, his wife Edith, his children, knew, as you said, how he felt about statues, particularly equestrian statues, and didn't want to be memorialized in marble. And yet, was it just the persuasiveness of some of these memorialization groups that persuaded them little by little to support those kinds of efforts?
I think it is, but I also think it's a matter of just happenstance and how some of the original designs of these memorials didn't fit with their conception of their father either. So if we ignore the tidal basin for a moment and just go to the island where he's memorialized today, sometimes we forget that there were other designs for that space. So Olmsted does the landscape design, but there is an architect who designed what was it's called an armillary sphere. It looks like a bunch of rings that they're not in motion, but they look like they could be in motion. And there was like a little bronze flame in the middle of this giant armillary sphere. And the kids didn't like that either. So Alice Roosevelt, I think, called them donuts in limbo when she saw them. And other kids were like, this is so abstract that it doesn't capture the essence of their father either. So when they see Paul Manship's design for the 16-foot statue that's there now, they didn't like that either. But they kind of were like at the end of their tether. It had been years and nothing went up. So I think you resign yourself in some cases, too, to say that nothing is really going to be perfect. And, TR wouldn't have wanted these things, perhaps, and we know that pretty definitively. But TR is not around anymore, so he doesn't get much of a say. Now, with that said, there are some memorials that I think, very much the family had a hand in. So whether it's Sagamore Hill, which when you go to Sagamore Hill, I think you really do feel the essence of Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
I mean, it's his home, it's his stuff, it's arranged the way he would have liked it arranged. And, there's something about that seems really genuine. I think the birthplace, although it's a replica, there's some really sincere elements of that make you feel like you're going back in time to the 1850s in New York City, which is a remarkable, feat for any memorial to pull off. But, you guys mentioned as well some of the things that either bear his imprinter or they bear his name, like, there's Pelican Island Bird Preserve, or there's Devil's Tower, the first national monument in America, natural monument. All of those bear a little bit of TR, and I think some of them are really special as well.
Your book mentions a lot of the biographies that were written almost like memorials to him.
Yep.
And I know the family wasn't real pleased with some of those. Could you describe some of the biographies that came about as memorials to help shape TR's legacy and memory?
Yes. So there's two things that are happening in 1920 around the time that TR dies in 1919. There's a revolution in biography that's happening at that moment where any amateur thinks that they can write a biography. And so there's loads of people that are coming out of the woodwork when he dies that said, I knew TR, and this is the man as I knew him. So, for example, his a New York City, I think, is he a pastor? I think, but he's a clergyman. Writes about TR and how religious TR was.
Yep.
And there's Owen Wister writes a book about my friend TR, and just about everyone that knew him writes about him. TR the intellectual, TR the cowboy, TR whatever.
Yeah.
And all of them, all of them aren't wrong in the sense that he was all of those things. But this is where perspective is really important. If you add all these things together, you might wind up with something that's really wonderful. But they were all what we would call hagiographies. They were basically trying to make TR out as a saint.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bad idea in biography, because what you wind up doing is dehumanizing the person. And biography tends to go through this sort of these sort of ups and downs like a roller coaster. So you often start out, especially with presidents, with hagiographies. The saintly version of the president. I remember when Gerald Ford died, everyone said, "Oh, Gerald Ford really saved the country." But if you ask people in 1974, when Gerald Ford, when he pardoned Richard Nixon, they would not have said that was a good thing.
Nope.
But that was forgotten the day he died. Now, as time goes on, that changes again. So in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, there's about 10 years where you have biographers writing nothing but glowing reviews.
Yeah.
And then in 1931, there's an academic treatment of Roosevelt. Henry Pringle writes a biography in which he characterizes Roosevelt as a juvenile delinquent and an egomaniac. And it's so focused on that character trait of him being an egomaniac that it sheds almost all of the other material. And I can get why he wrote it too, because for a decade you have these glowing biographies. So it's so easy to just say, well, it's actually TR was the opposite of that. And it sells a lot of books. It wins the Pulitzer Prize. And for a generation, that is the dominant view of TR.
Yeah.
So it really is not until the 1990s that we get really solid academic nuance in 1970s, I should say. We get books like Edmund Morris's The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. We get David McCullough's book, Morning on Horsebacks. We get, in the 2000s, we get my favorite biography, Kathy Dalton's A Strenuous Life.
Yeah.
And we've had some fantastic biographies since then, too. But what we've done is we've gone through the ups and downs of saint and sinner, and we've settled somewhere in the middle, which is actually a rather human portrait of a man who was, at the end of the day, a human being. He had flaws, and he had wonderful characteristics as well.
Well, I know Henry Pringle's biography of TR really angered Edith, TR's wife. And in Sylvia Jukes Morris's biography of Edith, she talks about the strong opinions that the whole family had in the 1920s and 30s about all the different biographies. Edith couldn't stand having Herman Hagedorn, like she said, the starry-eyed mixture of fact and fiction. But I think my favorite reaction is Edith's to Pringle's book when she writes to Ethel, and she quotes and says, "On each page is a sneer or a slap at father. I cannot read it. I should like to burn it and mail the ashes back to its author."
How do you really feel?
Yes.
Well, you mentioned Herman Hagedorn. I wrote down a quote from Hagedorn, who is amongst that first generation of hagiographies for certain. He said in his Boy's Life of T.R., which was, I believe, still written in the last year of Roosevelt's life, one cannot explain him any more than you can explain electricity or falling in love.
I love that quote. I think that is actually that's a great metaphor for TR. The energy is hard to explain.
Yeah.
And there's some things about Hagedorn's work. Hagedorn's kind of like the high priest of Roosevelt memorialization, because he's not just a writer. He made films.
Yeah.
He collected. A lot of the reason why the Harvard collection is so big is down to one man, Herman Hagedorn. So I think we've got to give credit where credit is due. He was a major figure in the memory of Theodore Roosevelt, and we actually owe a lot to him. But he was also a pretty bombastic and hyperbolic writer. And when he was really at the height of his career in World War I and just after World War I, he was writing a lot of tripe. But on TR, what I can say too, he got better over time. When he writes, Roosevelt's of Sagamore Hill, That's a much more nuanced book than A Boy's Life or
Yeah.
early stuff. And I think that's what's really interesting is that he was quite tempered early on by other figures who were more mature. So in that first meeting of the Memorial Association in New York, 3 days after Roosevelt dies, Hagedorn says, and remember, Hagedorn's a kind of small player in 1919. He's not as well known as, we're talking about like Elihu Root, New York senator and former Secretary of State is in the room. And Hagedorn says, we got to talk about TR and Americanism. We need to stop the communists. And this is in 1919. That fits. And Root says to Hagedorn, kind of like, sit down, young fella.
Yeah.
We're not going to do that at all. We're going to, we're going to have an artistic thing that's going to last for generations to come. And I think what Hagedorn got, certainly by the time he passed away in 1963, was that you can't make anything for one time. Whatever you make and do, you have to think long term at least when you're talking about memory, because it can't last. And gosh, we've got so much going on at the moment with TR's legacy, whether it's Presidential Library, the library that's being built in Medora, whether we're talking about Edmund Morris's papers, there's just so much going on right now that I think we're at this inflection point where everyone needs to be thinking long term, because we will still be talking about Theodore Roosevelt 100 years from now, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. With Herman Hagedorn, you talked about him wearing out his shoe leather, tirelessly walking the corridors of the Senate office building, trying to organize a national celebration of TR's 100th birthday. And he doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. At times, we look at things that he did, taking the Rough Riders interviews and turning that into a novel rather than something historic, a good, historic piece. But yeah, he really deserves a lot of credit.
I mean, the centennial is held in 1958. It's actually held for a year from 1957 to 1958. But, that is largely down to Hagedorn. And he was able to mobilize the president, that's Eisenhower at the time, and a number of really key senators and governors in just about every state. Now, that is, when you think about it, that is incredible. And every one of those people, the politicians as well as Hagedorn and many of the other centenary staff, were laser focused on making that year all about TR. And there are some major outcomes from that we still have, whether it's books, whether it's the name of certain places. And there's a lot of memorialization that comes out of that. And Hagedorn returned to his theme of Americanism. And he found a more receptive audience in the 1950s when we were in the middle of a second Red Scare, right? Or near enough the end of it, I guess, anyway. But, communism was still a very dirty word in America in the 1950s. Maybe it still is. And he latched onto that and conservation as the two core themes of Roosevelt's 100th anniversary.
You probably can't overemphasize enough Hagedorn's role in keeping that memory and legacy alive. You can't really separate the Roosevelt Memorial Association and Herman Hagedorn during his life, I guess. But could you talk about some of those developments in the 1940s into the 50s with academics, with papers that Hagedorn maybe had a role in that started to revive Roosevelt's legacy after it being drugged into the depths with Pringle's biography?
Sure, yeah. And I just should say as well at the outset that I'm the public historian for the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and this is the organization that's still around from 1920. Yeah. When they merge with the Women's Memorial Association in the late 40s and early 50s, they really refocus on a number of things, but academic pursuits is one of them. And the thing that counters the Pringle biography or offers an alternative view of Roosevelt is a project that starts in the late 40s and early 50s around TR's letters. Because what made him such an authority was that he had access to a lot of personal papers at Sagamore Hill and at the Library of Congress that previous biographers didn't have access to. But he didn't have access to everything. And particularly the post-presidential years were absent from Pringle's biography. And Herman Hagedorn, as well as a bunch of other far-sighted members of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, they decided to start a letters project that would put together all of TR's most important letters. And that's not an easy thing because TR, we estimate, wrote anywhere from 150 to maybe as much as 200,000 letters during his lifetime.
Yeah.
And then there's all the letters that come into him as well. So this is an incredible project, and it's led by a chap called Elting Morrison, who was a professor at MIT, and he had written a brilliant biography of Admiral Sim, who was a World War I naval genius. And he was hired by the Theodore Roosevelt Association and worked with Harvard University, where the Memorial Association's papers were being moved in the 40s. And they went through every letter they could find of Theodore Roosevelt from the Library of Congress, from the Harvard archives, and they collected them in 8 volumes and published them in the early 50s, from 1950 to 1954. And those letters changed people's minds about Theodore Roosevelt. So a really good example in my book that I use is one of America's most prominent professors of history at the time is a guy called Richard Hofstadter from Columbia University, who would have written important books about the political tradition in America, about the age of reform. And his views of Roosevelt start out in the late 40s and early 50s as extremely negative. And they sort of morph into a much, much varied and more nuanced view. And we get a bunch of other historians like John Morton Bloom and others that are writing about TR as part of a political tradition in America rather than an outlier. And that really brings him back from the precipice where he was with Pringle as just an outsized personality, a gnashing teeth, and an egomaniac, or as Kathy Dalton calls that, the crazy Teddy view of Theodore Roosevelt. It's not extinguished by the 1950s, but it's the TRA and its foresight to fund that letters project that then leads to a revival in his image.
Yeah. Dispels the arsenic and old lace, TR.
Right, of Teddy Brewster charging up the stairs thinking they're San Juan Heights.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
In your book, you devoted quite a few pages to the influence and success of Dr. John Gable, who was the executive director of the TRA. Would you tell us about his work?
Yes, so John Gable is incredibly important, and it's a great regret that I never got a chance to meet the man. John Gable died, I believe it's 2004, although I might be off by a year. He died rather suddenly, but he became the Herman Hagedorn of the next generation. So he took over the directorship of the Theodore Roosevelt Association in 1975, and I think the association, it's safe to say, was kind of on the ropes, having lost Herman Hagedorn and a bit of direction and enthusiasm in those intervening years. And John Gable, really, with the help of Ethel Roosevelt, Derby, and P. James Roosevelt, 2 prominent family members, they come up with a new strategic plan for the association that sees it into the next generation. So John Gable is responsible for the Theodore Roosevelt Association Journal, which is an academic peer-reviewed journal, and he's responsible for increasing membership and making sure effectively that any, I wouldn't say negative depictions, but ahistorical depictions of Roosevelt were targeted. And he solicited a network of academics, friends. I mean, a really good example is Edmund Morrison, who became a close friend of John Gable. Edmund Morris was writing the book The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, which eventually won the Pulitzer Prize, and kind of takes us to the other side of Pringle, a very sort of the great man biography of Theodore Roosevelt. But Gable would write to Edmund Morris and say, have you looked at this aspect of Roosevelt's life? And, you can find elements of this story you're trying to tell here. And he did this with a number of others as well. He became a reference guide for anyone interested in Theodore Roosevelt. And that's so important because it channeled a lot of the ideas that people were having through John Gable. And Gable was an academic himself. He studied at Brown. He wrote a book on TR and the Progressive Party. He's probably one of the most instrumental people in keeping TR's legacy alive after Herman Hagedorn. And it's not just academics. He's responsible for birthday parties for TR at the White House. He's responsible for overseas ventures like the Roosevelt Study Center in Middleburg. So he's a really important player in that world. And I think we owe a lot to both of them, actually, in terms of their legacy is still felt in that TR universe.
You had mentioned in your book about how academic treatments often precede the popular culture depictions, whether it's in movies or other forms. Could you talk a little bit about how the times determine how Roosevelt is portrayed in various movies over time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll give you a really great example. One of my favorite examples of this is when the United States is facing the prospect of war with Germany after 1939. So Franklin Roosevelt is, of course, left with the decision to stay neutral at the outset of the war, and does so. And there's a movie released called The Monroe Doctrine in 1939. Now it's a movie that most people won't know, so you're not going to easily find this, but it's a 20-minute reel-to-reel that features obviously President Monroe, who is the not the author, but the sort of the one whose name is affixed to the message. And basically, the Monroe Doctrine, of course, is the idea that the United States will stay out of European matters, and Europeans need to stay out of Western Hemispheric matters, no longer colonize the Western Hemisphere. So the film ends with TR, who, of course, is the TR corollary, or the Roosevelt corollary, is the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which means that TR expanded the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine to say that not only should Europeans stay out of the Americas, but the Americas are going to be monitored and policed basically by the United States, by force if necessary. Yeah. So it showed that TR was a part of this long tradition of keeping out of European affairs and Europe keeping out of American affairs. And in 1939, that movie made so much sense to people because, Franklin Roosevelt is saying the same thing. We're going to stay out of war, and let's hope that this ends soon. 2 years later, after Pearl Harbor and after the United States gets, pulled into the war, there's another film that's released called Teddy and the Rough Riders, which is, again, a 20-minute short released by the same studio. The same actor is playing Roosevelt, but instead, this time, he's an interventionist. And we have the historical narrative of the Spanish-American War, where the United States has to get involved, right? Mm-hmm. Have to get involved to save Cuba from, the terrible Spanish. And now it makes sense that Franklin Roosevelt is saving the world from Nazism and Japanese autocracy, right? So, I mean, the reason why these are so good examples is because the format is the same, the studio is the same, the actor is the same, and yet the narrative couldn't be any more different. So my point about film in particular is that it always follows the times that we're living in to an extent. Yeah. Now, I do think that film has gotten pretty absurd now, and we've got so many depictions of TR, and whether it's on The Simpsons or whether it's on, there's so many, like we said, The Night at the Museum. It's gotten a little bit abstract, but still the serious films, you can see that there's some relationship to the context in which they're made.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the 1970s depiction at the conclusion of our involvement in Vietnam. We've got The Wind and the Lion. Pretty outlandish depiction.
Right, and that one doesn't even follow. That doesn't even follow history because it's about Theodore Roosevelt in the film invades Morocco. I mean, he never did that in real life. So this is really it's an abstraction, but there's that connection to the Mayeguez incident in 1975. It's the last. Most people see it as the last battle of the Vietnam War. And again, America is this bombastic interventionist foreign policy that they're trying to relate TR to basically the Johnson and Nixon administrations.
Going along with that, I know not just, you mentioned presidents have used TR and invoked him in many of their speeches and policies, but also commercial marketing has used TR quite a bit from even before his death. So please tell us some of the ways that companies have used TR to promote their products.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, there's so many ways. I mean, presidents are, well, I should say this. Some presidents are really good spokespeople for companies. Some presidents, you might turn off consumers if you put their face. But I think TR is kind of on the, he's on the good side of those things. He winds up being a good spokesperson for most companies. So there was a Roosevelt automobile in the 1910s and 20s. There are a number of strange advertisements, like for cigarettes, TR didn't smoke. a number of whiskeys. Presidents, almost every president has a whiskey. Even if you're a bad president, you get a whiskey. So there's a number of, including there's a absolutely delicious Hudson Valley Rough Riders whiskey that you can buy nowadays. I think I should be getting paid something for that plug, but I mean, computers. There's a TV station about wellness that uses quotes from Theodore Roosevelt. You can check out Cadillac in 2015 had a integrated what we would call a guerrilla marketing campaign where they asked people to dare greatly, which is a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. They read out a big speech from that Citizenship in a Republic speech that Roosevelt gave in 1910 is the basis for in some of these, you never even see the car. You never see the Cadillac. You just get the brand at the end, and it's associated with Roosevelt. So, I mean,
those were really well done.
Yeah, some of these are exceptional, and you remember them, and that is the purpose, is that you remember them. And TR is a character in all of these that you can remember, easily identifiable, trustworthy, right, which is key to branding. So that makes him pretty powerful, and a lot. I can't say my favorite one is Schlitz. Yeah. So, do you guys remember Schlitz? I mean, most people nowadays probably don't remember Schlitz, but Schlitz was the king of beers before Budweiser was the king of beers.
Yep.
And in the 1950s and 60s, they were kind of on the decline, and to sort of stop that skid, they brought in TR, and they had this ad where they said TR got a consignment of Schlitz sent to Mombasa when he was visiting Africa. And they made a big deal out of this. And later on, they had Sorrel Book, who was an actor from Dukes of Hazzard. He was Boss Hogg from Dukes of Hazzard. Mm-hmm. Advertising him as TR. He was the actor for Schlitz malt liquor. And anyway, none of this ever happened. TR never drank Schlitz. He never got Schlitz in Africa. It's a complete myth. It's fabricated by Madison Avenue. And it's still around. If you Google Schlitz and TR, there are some really serious, books and articles about this, but there's no evidence. So, I mean, there's any number of ways you can imagine they've used them.
Oh, yeah.
That's why that you needed the pigskin covers. It's just easier to clean all the malt liquor when you spill it all over your book collection. Well, over time, you said those themes for classifying TR that have been used for memorialization, the Americanism, the cowboy myth, progressivism, conservation, preacher of righteousness, man of letters, that's been pretty consistently used. But more in the 21st century, you said there's been his portrayals become more of an abstraction. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we've gotten some of the best biographies out there about Roosevelt now, and we have a pretty good idea of who he is. And now I think we're starting to just toy around with his image a little bit. Yeah. And I think there's nothing wrong with that as long as we start saying, well, this is an abstraction rather than. Let me give you an example from, that has a real relevance to today. Obviously, gender norms in TR's time were pretty straightforward, men and women. And obviously now, transgender identities and queerness, and this is all a very modern or contemporary thing. And I think although TR didn't grapple with gender as being any more than male or female, there are people that are looking at things like masculinity and femininity. And there's a troupe of theater actors in Brooklyn that have done this play called Rose of Elvis, which mashes together Theodore Roosevelt and Elvis, but it's an all-female cast that plays around with it really bends gender. So, I mean, this is where the contemporary meets the past on a really hot topic in America right now. And what you come up with is a really bizarre treatment of the past, but something that is still very compelling. So that's what I mean about it being abstract, is that because we see everything through our own time, we lead with that. And that means that it's not really true. And as long as you go, well, that's not really true, that's okay. As soon as you start saying that TR actually was a woman, well, you might have some disagreement there. But, some of the movies are the same. The Simpsons, there's a great episode called Smell the Roosevelts, like Smell the Roses, where Theodore Roosevelt takes Bart along on a ride and sort of schools him on life. And it is, it's kind of nonsense, but it's fun, and you kind of get the lesson for our time in that. So that happened in art a long time ago when art went abstract, right? I mean, when Picasso drew a woman, she had a square eye, right? I mean,
Yep.
so we're kind of there now. We're getting the essence of these things, but it's through a much different lens.
I guess that reminds me of Hamilton, right? About that abstraction with genders and racial depictions, and I don't know if that opened the door for, what did you say the name of it was? Rose of
Elvis.
I have not even heard of that yet.
I hadn't
Wow.
either.
Something to look up.
It's well worth a look.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to spend some time with it because it's not an easy play to get into. But Hamilton's a great example because, of course, I'm pretty sure Alexander Hamilton didn't know hip hop, right? So I mean, that's where we are. We see it through our own eyes.
Yeah. And it gets people interested in the historical person, and they may take that beyond what they've seen and research more.
I think we forgot really to talk about when we were getting into the early years after Roosevelt's death, the role of family in shaping TR's memory, particularly Edith. Could you talk a little bit about her? What was her role in shaping Roosevelt's memory and legacy?
Yeah, I mean, Edith is pretty central to this. She early on tries to stop people from publishing letters that they have from Roosevelt for fear that they'll be taken out of context and, they might depict Roosevelt in a negative light. Mm-hmm. So she's very conscious of that. And also Herman Hagedorn is not yet quite her confidant in this memorialization. So Hagedorn actually wanted to do oral histories of people on Long Island that knew TR. And Edith kind of shot him down and said she didn't think it was a good idea and told neighbors not to speak to him. Yeah. So she was instrumental. And when it comes to Pringle, she thought that Pringle's biography, that because he was looking at archives and correspondence, she thought his biography was going to be a strong contender for the best of all the biographies, but she was let down there. So she's kind of a gatekeeper. And so is her eldest son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Mm-hmm. He is very much a gatekeeper as well until his death in 1945. And he lives on the grounds of Sagamore Hill next door to his mother for a number of years. So, but they're not the only ones. Ethel Roosevelt Darby, TR's youngest daughter, is very much a gatekeeper as well. She's very much responsible for Dr. John Gable's appointment as the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. And she stays in Long Island too. So she's, looking over a lot of those properties like Sagamore Hill and helping curators go through the archives there. So the family is really, really important in maintaining, and I think that's still the case too. I mean, you'll see today there's family members on the board of directors of Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. Mm-hmm. There are a number of family members that are vice presidents in the Theodore Roosevelt Association. If I was a family member, and I'm not, but if I am, I would feel a strong connection and a drive or an impetus to protect that legacy as well. I think that's only natural. Yeah. It's just, TR is much more famous than my great grandparents were, but I can get the same. I get the same rationale for why you'd want to maintain the legacy in a way that speaks to the person that you knew or that's been handed down to you.
I wanted to ask you one more question, and that has to do with your role with the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum that's under construction in Medora. So could you talk a little bit about your inputs to that library that's under construction and how you envision people's experience? What will they take away from Roosevelt with his legacy and his memory when they see that in a couple of years?
Sure. Well, I think, first of all, credit needs to be given to the leaders of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. There's two people in particular. Ed O'Keefe, who's the CEO and has been working on this project for a number of years. And I think his work with the board to develop the values of the library, they fit very closely to what Theodore Roosevelt's best values were, whether it was that idea of daring greatly or thinking boldly or caring deeply. those are all ideas that I think will resonate with people for years to come. And everyone that comes into the library is going to be getting that sort of treatment from TR. I mean, the way it's designed is to basically put you into Theodore Roosevelt's shoes in a way, and to make you understand Theodore Roosevelt's life and the lessons that we might be able to draw from his life through the experiences of those lives. So, I mean, and it's not all fun and games. It's not all adventures and exploration. Some of it is traumatic, like loss. We all know that he lost his mother and his wife on Valentine's Day, and that's a trauma that would haunt him for years to come. I mean, even the trauma of asthma and his youth and his sickly health. That's something that should stay with you. And one of the big themes, I think, is perseverance, risk taking.
Yeah.
That idea of going above and beyond what you think is possible. That thinking boldly idea. That's something that follows Theodore Roosevelt around in his life, and those are things that we can take from his life and say, that makes me more resilient. That makes me more effective. That makes me more exciting and creative. So my hope is that when people go in there, that's what they're going to take away. And I can tell you actually that the way it's been designed so far, that's exactly what they're aiming to do. Every part of the museum is loaded with that sort of value and character. And Ed is very much responsible for this. He's been shepherding the project along for the last, I don't know, is it as many as 5 years now, but it's being built right now. I mean, it's not an idea anymore. It's real. And that alone is a very exciting thing. The interior isn't yet finished, but the exterior is going up, and it's a beautiful building. The design is by an architecture firm called Snowhetta, and they have thought about sustainability. They've thought about ecology, how this building fits with the environment, including the visual aspects of it. But indigenous species that were around in TR's time, and so I mean, it's really an incredibly detail-oriented project. Yeah. And I just cannot wait until 2026 when the doors open and we get to see.
Oh, yeah.
We get to learn from TR. I also have to give a shout out as well to the Theodore Roosevelt Association. I mean, they're doing some really exciting things too with experiential tours. They have an annual meeting every year that gets better and better. The partners, the institutions that are a part of TR and TR memorialization, they are really dynamic groups that are doing things to not just kind of keep TR's legacy alive, but to put you in his shoes. Like this year, for example, the Theodore Roosevelt Association is running a tour with me and others in the Adirondacks, where TR first listened to birds, and not first, but first listed birds, say, and and really fell in love with nature and understood how nature interacted with humans. I mean, these are great experiences, and I think they're important for us to kind of go and walk in his footsteps sometimes to see the things that he saw.
Very much. You write a wonderful summary at the end of the book on page 218, and it just says, Roosevelt's ghost appears in all quarters of American life. This book only presents the most important sightings as examples of the interpretations of public memory. The mythical Roosevelt, as John Allen Gable put it, surpassed the real Roosevelt almost instantly after he died in 1919. That myth or ghost has evolved continuously, a derivative of the personal ambitions of those who conjured TR. By considering Roosevelt for their various perspectives, we can clearly see how memorializers created legacy themes and consequently transformed TR's popular image again and again. The only apparent constant is Roosevelt's popularity. He remains as germane today as a century ago. Our impressions of him may change, but until the time when his memory is entirely insignificant, a scenario that seems utterly unlikely, Roosevelt's ghost will continue to inspire debate and interest. Like the Cheshire Cat, the image of Roosevelt's pince-nez, mustache, and toothy smile flourishes in our imaginations, and even when they fade, the image leaves a lasting impression. I think that is just a wonderful description of TR. It's like he occupies a place in your heart and soul. So, thank you for writing that.
Well, thank you. That's it's quite touching. And I mean, as an author, I think you hope that what you're writing resonates with people, and it's absolute pure delight that it's percolated with you guys, and you've thought about it, and you've read the book so thoroughly. So thank you both so very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's probably going to wrap up our discussion here of Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, The History and Memory of an American Icon by Michael Patrick Cullinane. Michael, how can folks learn more about your work?
You can find me on michaelpatrickcullinane.com, and you can also check out my podcast. It's called The Gilded Age and Progressive Era. It's on all major platforms. And, of course, if you want to buy a copy of Theodore Roosevelt's Ghost, it's, well, as they say, it's with all good booksellers, and you know who they are.
Very good.
Well, thank you for being on the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks so much, guys.
We had a bully time talking with Professor Cullinane, whose work in the Theodore Roosevelt community is prolific. If you enjoyed that conversation with Michael Patrick Cullinane, then be sure to tune in later this month when we air part 2 of our conversation with him, talking about his 2021 book, Remembering Theodore Roosevelt, Reminiscences of His Contemporaries, which provides some never-before-published primary material on Theodore Roosevelt drawn from forgotten oral histories with his close friends and family. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
You can find this podcast on our website, talkaboutteddy.com, where you can see show notes and transcripts, links to resources, and additional TR content. And please, tell us what you think.
If you've enjoyed our content, please consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about us, because it really does make a tremendous difference and it helps others find this show.
We hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And until then, as our friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you have where you are.
bullet.